On a misty Mississippi morning in 1850, the world was born from gray water and green shadow. Along the muddy banks of the Pearl River, the air hung thick and silent, broken only by the drip of condensation from cypress knees. There, standing perfectly side by side at the water's edge, as if waiting for their owner to return from a morning wash, sat a pair of heavy, worn leather boots, footprints, deep and desperate, pressed into the soft earth, leading down to them. But from the river, no footprints returned. These were the boots of Frank Dyer, the most feared overseer in the county. Yet Dyer wasn't missing. A slave named Noah was. The boots were a message. A ghost story whispered into the fog before the man was even gone. A riddle that would haunt the plantation for generations. What power could make a man walk into a river and leave nothing but his master's boots behind? What secret did he know that turned the water into a doorway? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of the boots began weeks earlier, under a punishing sun that bleached the sky to a hazy, indifferent white. On the Wallace plantation, the world was measured in endless rows of cotton, the white bowls like fists of snow clenched against the oppressive heat. The air was a physical weight, thick with humidity, the dust of the fields, and the unspoken misery of the people who toiled there. It was a place where hope came to die, suffocated by the relentless cycle of sunup to sundown. In this world lived Noah Johnson. To the casual eye, he might have seemed like any other field hand, strong of back and weary of spirit. But Noah was different. He was not a broken man, but one whose spirit was held deep within. A cool, still well in a desert of suffering. Years of labor had corded his arms with muscle, but his true strength was in his quiet, unnerving stillness. He moved with an economy of motion that grated on the nerves of the overseer, a deliberate grace that seemed to refuse the frantic, fearful energy of the plantation. His eyes, often cast downward in a feigned posture of submission, missed nothing. He saw the silent flight of a heron taking wing from the swamp, the subtle shift in the river's current after a hard rain, the nervous tick that jumped in the overseer's jaw just before a rage. That overseer was Frank Dyer, a man whose authority was his only asset. He was of moderate height but carried himself with an unearned swagger, his shoulders perpetually thrown back as if challenging the world to a fight he knew he couldn't win. His face was perpetually flushed, a roadmap of broken capillaries from too much sun and cheap whiskey. His cruelty was not the grand, theatrical sadism of some masters, but a petty, gnawing thing, born of a deep-seated fear of being seen as weak. He was a small man desperate to cast a large shadow, and he fixated on Noah because Noah's quiet dignity felt like a personal mockery of his power. Noah's silence was a mirror, and Dyer did not like the reflection he saw. The conflict that had been simmering for months finally boiled over on a Tuesday afternoon. The heat was at its peak, a shimmering haze rising from the baked earth. Dyer, looking for a reason, any reason, to assert his dominance, found one in Noah. He accused him of stealing a moment of rest, of shirking his duties. The accusation was baseless. Noah had merely paused to retie the worn rope that served as a handle on his heavy cotton sack, a task that took no more than a few seconds. But it was enough. "You think that sun is just for warming your back, boy?" Dyer's voice cut through the drone of insects, sharp and ugly. "You think Master Wallace pays me to watch you gaze at the clouds?" Noah remained silent, his face a mask of neutrality. He finished his knot and straightened up, his gaze fixed on the middle distance, refusing to give Dyer the satisfaction of a reaction. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Dyer's face was inches from Noah's. He shoved him hard, a jolt that would have sent a smaller man stumbling. Noah barely moved, his feet planted in the Mississippi soil as if he were rooted to it. "I'll teach you to respect your betters." The whipping post stood stark and lonely at the edge of the field, a dark monument to the plantation's true currency, which was not cotton, but pain. Dyer tied Noah's wrists to the rough-hewn wood himself, his movements jerky with a kind of furious excitement. The scene was not described in the gratuitous, bloody detail of a dime novel. Its horror was more subtle, reflected in the faces of those forced to watch. The other enslaved people flinched with each crack of the lash, their own backs remembering the sting. Elara, a young woman who shared a quiet, unspoken bond with Noah, clutched a small, half-carved wooden bird in her pocket, the sharp edges digging into her palm until her knuckles were bone white. She kept her eyes on the ground, her tears mixing with the dust at her feet. Old man Josiah, the oldest man on the plantation, a living chronicle of its sorrows, stopped his work entirely. He leaned on his hoe and watched, his ancient face grim and knowing, his eyes holding a sorrow so deep it seemed to contain the history of their people. He did not look away. That evening, the air in the cramped slave quarters was thick with the smell of sweat, sorrow, and the simmering, impotent anger of the oppressed. Elara knelt by Noah's cot, a small wooden bowl in her hands. She gently tended to the raw, bleeding wounds on his back with a poultice of crushed herbs and mud, her touch as light as a moth's wing. The silence between them was heavy with things that could not be said, a shared grief that was too vast for words. "He'll kill you one day, Noah," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "For nothing, for looking at him wrong, for being a man." Noah's voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "He can break the skin, he can't touch the soul." He stared at the rough wooden wall of the cabin. A shadow fell over them. It was old man Josiah, his presence filling the small space with a quiet authority that no overseer could ever command. He didn't speak of the whipping, of the pain, or of Dyer. Instead, he spoke of the river. "The river has a long memory, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It remembers the Choctaw who walked its bottom like dry land, moving between the currents. It remembers the Spanish gold that sunk in the flood of '39, a fortune lost in a single night of churning water. It takes what it's owed, and sometimes it gives a man a path." Josiah's words hung in the air, weaving themselves into the fabric of the night. He was not just talking about water, he was talking about something else, something ancient and powerful. He was offering a different kind of knowledge, a wisdom that flowed deeper and stronger than the rules of the plantation. The river was not just a boundary or a source of water. It was a potential ally, a force of nature with its own rules, its own secrets. It was a possible route to freedom, a doorway hidden in plain sight. Noah listened, his body aching, his spirit bruised but not broken, and for the first time, a flicker of a plan, as formless and silent as the morning mist that rose from the Pearl River, began to coalesce in the deepest, most hidden corners of his mind. He did not know how, and he did not know when, but he knew the river had just called his name. He would answer. The days following the whipping marked a profound shift in Noah's existence. The pain in his back was a constant fiery reminder, but it was no longer a source of suffering. It was fuel. He was no longer just enduring. He was studying. The plantation, once a sprawling prison of labor, transformed into a complex map of opportunity and risk. His perspective sharpened, his focus narrowed to a single point on the horizon, a point only he could see. He began to watch Frank Dyer not as a slave watches a master, but as a hunter watches his prey. He memorized the man's routines with a chilling precision. He knew that Dyer started his mornings with a swig of whiskey from a tarnished silver flask, that he inspected the northern fence line around mid-morning, and that he always ended his day with a solitary walk along the riverbank. It was there, with the setting sun painting the water in hues of orange and blood, that the overseer seemed most himself, kicking at the mud, his prized leather boots leaving deep, arrogant impressions in the soft earth. Noah's senses, already honed by a life that demanded constant awareness, grew even sharper. He became a creature of the earth, reading its subtle language. He noticed the way the moss grew thickest on the north side of the cypress trees, a natural compass that pointed the way to freedom. He learned to read the clouds, not just for the promise of rain, but for the direction of the wind and the speed of its travel. The world became a book of signs, and he was its most devoted reader. He began to gather things in secret, small tokens of his burgeoning plan. A shard of flint, chipped from a field stone, was wrapped in a piece of cloth and hidden in the wall of his cabin. A small, hard gourd, no bigger than his fist, was hollowed out, dried and stoppered with a plug of wood, a vessel for water. From the smokehouse, a place he was forbidden to enter, he stole 3 strips of salted pork fat, wrapping them in leaves and burying them near the base of a lightning-scarred oak tree at the edge of the woods. Each stolen item, each secret observation, was a stitch in the tapestry of his escape. Dyer, for his part, felt the shift in Noah. He couldn't name it, couldn't point to a single act of defiance, but he sensed it in the air between them. He misinterpreted Noah's quiet focus as a new, more profound insolence, a silent rebellion that was more infuriating than any backtalk. The overseer's paranoia, always simmering just beneath the surface, began to boil. He started watching Noah with an unnerving intensity, his eyes following him across the fields, during meals, even as he rested. He was looking for a crack in the facade, a flicker of the plan he could feel but not see. In his frustration, Dyer tried to turn the community against Noah. He offered extra rations of molasses and cornmeal to anyone who would report on Noah's activities, on any strange behavior or whispered conversations. He dangled the promise of a slightly less miserable existence in front of them, hoping to buy their loyalty. But the quarters remained silent. The people, bound by a shared suffering that Dyer could never comprehend, closed ranks around Noah. Their loyalty to him, to one of their own, was stronger than their hunger. This silent, unified defiance only infuriated Dyer more. It confirmed his suspicion that something was happening, something he was not a part of, something that threatened the fragile scaffolding of his authority. The danger of his undertaking became terrifyingly real one afternoon. Deep in the woods that bordered the swamp, far from the prying eyes of the plantation, Noah was marking his path. He used his flint shard to carve a small, almost imperceptible notch into the base of a cypress tree, a landmark for a journey he would have to make in darkness. The air was still, the only sound the gentle scraping of stone against bark. Then he heard it, the distant, eager baying of Dyer's hounds. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He dropped the flint and flattened himself into a shallow, muddy hollow, his heart pounding against the damp earth like a trapped bird. He clawed at the ground, pulling handfuls of wet leaves and mud over his body, burying himself in the scent of decay and life. The barking grew louder, closer. He could hear the crashing of undergrowth as the dogs, followed by the heavy tread of a man, approached. They passed mere feet from his hiding place. He held his breath, the smell of wet dog and Dyer's sweat thick in the air. Dyer stopped. Noah could hear the creak of his leather boots, the jingle of the metal on his belt. He could feel the man's presence, a palpable aura of suspicion and rage. "Something ain't right," Dyer muttered to himself, his voice a low growl. "I can smell it." He sniffed the air, his senses, though dulled by whiskey, still sharp enough to detect the unusual. For a terrifying moment, Noah was certain he was found. He braced himself for the kick, the shout, the teeth of the dogs. But then, with a frustrated curse, Dyer moved on, calling his hounds to heel. The sounds faded into the distance, leaving Noah alone in the silence of the woods, his body trembling, the mud of the earth feeling less like a hiding place and more like a grave. The close call did not deter him. It solidified the danger, yes, but it also hardened his resolve. He knew now that there was no room for error. That night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, Noah sought out old man Josiah. He found him by the woodpile, his gnarled hands methodically sharpening an axe blade with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was a comforting, constant sound in the nervous quiet of the quarters. "You spoke of the Choctaw," Noah began, his voice low, barely a whisper. "Of walking the river. Was that just a story, old man? A tale to make children sleep?" Josiah didn't look up from his work. "All stories are true, son," he rumbled, his voice deep and resonant. "It just depends on how you listen. The Choctaw didn't walk on the water. They walked with it. They knew its secrets. They knew the hidden currents that run beneath the surface, the underwater shelves of rock and sand that form a hidden path. To them, the river was a road, not an enemy. That man, Dyer, he just sees mud and water. He stomps on its banks with his heavy boots and curses its power. He doesn't listen. He never has." Josiah set down the axe and the whetstone. From a small leather pouch at his belt, he produced another, smaller pouch, this one made of tightly woven reeds. He pressed it into Noah's hand. It was surprisingly heavy. "Crushed willow bark for fever," Josiah said, his fingers brushing Noah's. "Yarrow to stop bleeding, should the need arise. And this." He reached into his own pouch and pulled out a dark, smooth stone, worn by centuries of water into a perfect oval. It was cool to the touch. "This is from the riverbed itself, from the deep part, where the current is strongest. Hold it. Feel how old it is. It was here long before us, and it will be here long after we are gone. It knows the way. Noah closed his hand around the stone. It felt ancient, alive, a solid piece of the river's memory. It was a promise. His last secret meeting was with Ilara. He found her near the washing cauldron, the air steamy and smelling of lye soap. The setting sun cast long shadows, and in the fading light, her face was a portrait of worry and love. He didn't need to tell her his plan. She knew. She had known for days, had seen it in the new, distant focus of his eyes. "Your eyes are different, Noah," she said, her voice soft, her hands never ceasing their work of scrubbing a rough linen sheet. They're looking past the fields, past the trees. "Some things can't be caged, Ilara," he answered, his voice thick with the words he couldn't say. He couldn't tell her where he was going. He couldn't promise he would make it. He couldn't ask her to wait. To speak of it would be to give it a name, and to name it was to risk its discovery. She stopped her washing and dried her hands on her apron. From a pocket, she pulled a small bundle wrapped in a piece of cloth. She pressed it into his hand. It was light and fragrant. "For the journey," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. He knew without looking that it was dried berries and nuts, precious sustenance she had saved for herself and was now giving to him. The gesture was one of both hope and mourning, an acknowledgement of his departure and a prayer for his survival. He stood there for a moment, the weight of her gift in his hand, the smooth, cool river stone in his pocket, and the burning fire of his plan in his soul. He felt the immense, crushing weight of his decision. Freedom was a fire in his gut, a desperate, all-consuming need. But the thought of leaving Ilara, of leaving Josiah, of leaving the only community he had ever known, was a cold stone in his heart. He looked at her face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the sadness in her eyes. He understood then that to save himself, he had to become a ghost to those he loved. He had to disappear not just from the sight of his master, but from their lives as well. The price of his freedom was their grief. It was a debt he prayed he could one day repay. He gave her hand a final, gentle squeeze, a silent goodbye that spoke volumes, and then he turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows of the coming night. Dyer's obsession with Noah began to consume him, eating away at his duties like acid. It was a fever in his blood, a constant itching irritation under his skin. The broader machinery of the plantation, which he was paid to maintain with brutal efficiency, began to rust and fray at the edges from his neglect. A fence on the north pasture, weakened by a summer storm, finally gave way, and 3 valuable hogs wandered into the swamp, lost to the mire and the predators that lurked within it. In the gin house, the complex engine of belts and gears that separated seed from fiber was not properly oiled, and its rhythmic coughing and sputtering grew more alarming by the day, a mechanical protest against its overseer's distraction. The other slaves, who moved to the rhythm of fear and survival, sensed the shift in power. It was subtle at first, a fractional hesitation before obeying a command, a collective slowing of pace that was as imperceptible and as powerful as a change in the tide. They worked with a deliberate slowness that Dyer, in his focused myopic rage against Noah, failed to notice. His world had shrunk to the size of one man, and in his obsession, he had become blind to the quiet mutiny unfolding all around him. The consequences of this neglect did not go unnoticed by the man at the top of the plantation's cruel pyramid. Master Wallace, a portly, sweat-sheened man whose only true concern was profit, summoned Dyer to his study. The room was an island of cool, dark civility in a sea of sun-baked brutality, filled with the scent of expensive tobacco and polished mahogany. Wallace sat behind a massive desk, a ledger open before him, his fingers steepled as he regarded his overseer with cold, calculating eyes. "Frank," he began, his voice smooth but with an edge of steel, "I am hearing reports of, let us say, inefficiencies. The cotton yield from the South Field was down this week. 3 of my best hogs have apparently decided to take a permanent vacation in the swamp. The gin house sounds as if it is about to give up the ghost. What is the meaning of this?" Dyer, standing stiffly before the desk, felt a prickle of sweat on his neck. "It's the Johnson boy, sir," he said, his voice tight. "He's a cancer in the fields, sullen, defiant. He works just hard enough to avoid the lash, but his spirit is rotten. He poisons the others with his silence." Wallace took a slow puff from a long, thin cigar, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like a lazy ghost. "He is one man, Frank. You are the overseer. Your job, for which I pay you a handsome sum, is to manage my property, both the land and the people on it. Your job is not to engage in personal vendettas. A broken slave is as useless as a dead one, and a distracted overseer is a drain on my profits. Settle this, Frank. I am a patient man, but my patience has its limits. Break his spirit or sell him south to the sugar plantations where they have a more direct way of dealing with insolence. I don't care which, but I will not have my profits affected by your games." The final word was delivered with a quiet venom that left no room for argument. It was an ultimatum. Spurred by Wallace's cold threat, a new and terrible idea began to form in Dyer's mind. He needed a task that was not merely difficult, but impossible. He needed a crucible that would melt Noah's spirit into slag. He found his answer in a waterlogged, snake-infested patch of swampland at the far western edge of the property, a place the slaves called the Cypress Graveyard. It was a primeval tangle of cypress knees, sucking mud, and stagnant black water, useless for planting, and treacherous to traverse. It was a place where things went to die. The next morning, Dyer personally escorted Noah to the edge of the swamp. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the drone of a million insects. A water moccasin, thick as a man's arm, slid silently from a log into the dark water, its passage leaving barely a ripple. Dyer gestured toward the morass with a sweep of his arm, a malicious grin spreading across his flushed face. "Master Wallace wants this land cleared for new planting," he lied, his eyes glittering with cruel anticipation. "He thinks it can be drained and made profitable. You're just the man for the job. You have until the new moon, alone." The task was a sentence of slow, agonizing failure. It was designed to break Noah's body and spirit long before he could ever make a dent in the formidable landscape. The new moon was less than 3 weeks away. Clearing even a quarter-acre of the Cypress Graveyard in that time was a feat beyond any single man. Dyer expected to see despair in Noah's eyes, a plea for mercy, the satisfying crack of a spirit finally breaking. He saw nothing but the same calm, unnerving stillness that had haunted him for months. Noah simply picked up the axe and wading boots Dyer had brought for him and looked out at the swamp, his expression unreadable. But Noah did not despair. As he stood at the edge of the cypress graveyard, he did not see an impossible task. He saw a challenge of engineering and will. He did not see a punishment. He saw a period of intense, isolated preparation. He used his intelligence, the same sharp awareness that had allowed him to survive this long. Instead of wading immediately into the sucking mud that could pull a man down, he spent the first 2 days building a small causeway of fallen logs and sturdy branches, creating a stable path into the heart of the work area. He worked not during the punishing midday heat, but during the cooler, more forgiving hours of dawn and dusk, using the hottest part of the day to rest in the shade of a massive cypress, conserving his strength. He used the swamp's own water to his advantage, finding a small, clear spring that fed into the morass, using it to wash his tools and himself, finding a strange solace in its cool embrace. He didn't try to conquer the swamp with brute force. He worked with it, learning its rhythms, respecting its power. He learned where the ground was firmest, where the snakes were most likely to sun themselves, which vines were strong enough to hold his weight. As he worked, his body aching with a clean, honest fatigue, Noah felt his connection to the land deepening in a way he never had before. He was no longer just a slave toiling on its surface. He was a part of its ecosystem, a force of change within it. The physical hardship stripped away everything but his core will, burning away the last vestiges of fear and doubt. He was not just clearing a swamp, he was forging himself into a new man, one who understood the secret language of water and wood, of mud and sky. Each swing of the axe, each log moved, each foot of ground cleared, was a step closer to the river, a step closer to freedom. The cypress graveyard, intended as his prison, was becoming his training ground. A week later, Dyer came to watch, his flask of whiskey in hand, expecting to see Noah broken and begging, covered in mud and insect bites, his spirit crushed by the futility of his labor. Instead, he saw slow, steady, undeniable progress. A significant patch of the swamp had been cleared of undergrowth, the cypress knees cut low to the ground, the logs neatly stacked. He saw Noah working with a calm, rhythmic efficiency that seemed to mock the very idea of impossibility. Noah's movements were measured and powerful, his axe falling in a steady, hypnotic rhythm, each swing a testament to his unyielding will. There was no wasted motion, no sign of despair. Dyer watched for an hour, his face growing darker with every swing of Noah's axe. The sight of Noah's progress was a personal affront, a physical manifestation of his own failure to break him. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, fueled by whiskey and humiliation, Dyer threw his flask to the ground, grabbed a spare axe that lay nearby, and waded into the swamp himself. He began hacking wildly at a massive cypress knee, his movements clumsy and ineffective compared to Noah's measured pace. He was fighting the wood, his rage making him sloppy. Chips flew, but the knee barely registered the assault. He screamed at Noah, his voice cracking with fury and impotence. "Work faster, you devil!" he shrieked, his face contorted. "You think this is a holiday? You think you can mock me?" Noah didn't respond. He didn't even look at him. He just continued his work, his back a wall of corded muscle, each steady swing of his axe a silent, deafening act of defiance. The sound of his axe, rhythmic and clean, was an answer far more powerful than any words. Tunk, tunk, tunk. It was the sound of a will that would not break. Dyer his own arms aching after only a few minutes of his wild assault, finally gave up. Defeated and utterly humiliated, he let out a final strangled cry of rage, threw his own axe into the black, sucking mud, and stormed away, his boots squelching with his retreat. The psychological victory was entirely Noah's. He had not only met the impossible task, he had turned it back on his tormentor, proving that true power did not lie in the crack of a whip, but in the unyielding quiet of a man who had already decided he was free. The night of the new moon arrived, not with quiet darkness, but with a thick, suffocating blanket of humidity that promised violence. The air was a held breath, heavy and expectant. In his small, foul-smelling room in the main house, Frank Dyer was stewing in a broth of cheap whiskey and pure, unadulterated humiliation. The image of Noah, working with that damnable calm in the cypress graveyard, was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The sound of Noah's steady axe was an echo in his ears, mocking his own flailing, impotent rage. He had been bested, not by force, but by a quiet will he could not comprehend, and the shame of it was a physical sickness. He needed to hurt something. He needed to reassert the natural order of things, to feel the familiar, satisfying crunch of another man's spirit under his boot. Drunk and unsteady, he stumbled out of the house and into the oppressive darkness of the quarters. The slave cabins were dark shapes against a starless sky, silent but for the chirping of crickets and the low murmur of a coming storm. He was a predator prowling for weakness, his eyes scanning the familiar territory for a target, any target that could absorb the poison of his failure. He found it in the form of old man Josiah, who was sitting on a small stool outside his cabin, the faint light from his doorway illuminating his gnarled hands as they worked on a piece of wood. He was carving, as he often did, passing the time by giving life to a block of cypress. Dyer lurched toward him, his shadow falling over the old man like a shroud. "What's this, old man?" he slurred, his voice thick with malice. "Wasting time? Praying to your heathen gods?" He kicked out, his boot connecting not with Josiah, but with the delicate carving in his hands. It was a small, intricately detailed heron, its long neck gracefully curved, the wood splintered as it hit the hard-packed earth. The bird's neck snapping. Josiah looked down at the broken carving, his face a mask of sorrow, but he did not speak. He slowly bent to pick up the pieces. "Just passing the time, Mr. Dyer," he said, his voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the overseer's ragged breathing. "You're all alike." Dyer spat, his rage finding its focus. "You and that boy of yours, full of secrets and silence. You think you're better than me." He shoved Josiah, not with the full force of his strength, but with a petty, contemptuous push that was meant to degrade more than to injure. The old man, caught off balance, stumbled and fell to the ground, the broken pieces of his carving scattering in the dust. At that exact moment, a figure emerged from the deep shadows between the cabins. It was Noah. He had just returned from the swamp, his impossible task complete. He was leaner than before, the grueling work having stripped every ounce of softness from his frame, leaving only iron-hard muscle and bone. His skin was stained with mud and scratched by thorns, but his eyes, fixed on the scene before him, burned with a cold, clear light. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply moved to stand between the fallen old man and the drunken overseer. his presence a sudden, immovable wall. The air crackled, charged with a tension that was more than just the coming storm. Far in the distance, a low, guttural rumble of thunder echoed across the fields, a deep voice answering the unspoken challenge. Noah did not look at Josiah on the ground. He did not look at the broken bird. He looked directly into Frank Dyer's eyes, and for the first time, he did not bother to veil his gaze. Dyer saw the full, unshielded force of the man he had tried and failed to break. Noah's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the humid night air with the chilling finality of a closing coffin lid. "You will not touch him again." It was not a threat. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, a promise delivered from a place beyond fear or negotiation. It was the sound of a line being drawn in the dust of the earth, a boundary that Dyer knew, with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty. He did not have the power to cross. The overseer, for all his bluster and cruelty, was momentarily stunned into silence. The whiskey-fueled rage evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He saw something in Noah's eyes he had never seen before in any man, black or white. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't hatred. It was a chilling emptiness, a finality. He was looking at a man who had already left, a man whose soul was no longer bound by the rules of the plantation. He was looking at a ghost who was still breathing, unnerved, his authority shattered by a single quiet sentence. Dyer took a step back, then another. He opened his mouth to say something, to curse, to threaten, but the words died in his throat. He was looking at his own irrelevance, muttering a string of incoherent curses. He turned and stumbled away into the darkness, his retreat as pathetic and cowardly as his attack had been. Noah stood perfectly still until the sound of Dyer's footsteps faded, his own heart a steady, powerful drum in the electric silence. The storm, which had been a distant promise, began to assert its imminent arrival. The wind picked up, a low moan that whipped through the cotton fields and rattled the loose boards of the cabins. Dust and leaves swirled in frantic eddies around Noah's bare feet. He knelt and gently helped Josiah to his feet. His touch, surprisingly tender, he gathered the broken pieces of the wooden heron and placed them in the old man's trembling hand before guiding him into the relative shelter of his small cabin. "The sky is opening up for you, son," Josiah said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to harmonize with the approaching thunder. He looked at Noah, his ancient eyes filled with a deep, knowing sorrow and a fierce pride. "The river will be high tonight. It will be fast and dangerous. It's time," Noah said, his voice quiet but firm. There was no doubt in it, no hesitation. Josiah placed a gnarled hand on Noah's shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "Remember what I told you. The river is a road. Don't fight the water. You'll lose. Become the water. Let it carry you. Let it hide you. Let it carry you home." He pressed the smooth, cool river stone into Noah's palm one last time. "It knows the way." Noah nodded, the weight of the old man's blessing settling over him. He squeezed Josiah's shoulder in a silent gesture of gratitude and farewell, then slipped back out into the growing wind. He found Ilara standing in the doorway of her cabin, a silhouette against the dim light within. She was clutching the small, unfinished wooden bird she was always carving, her knuckles white. She had heard the confrontation, had seen Dyer's retreat. She knew. The wind tore at their clothes, whipping her simple dress against her legs and pulling strands of hair across her face. There was no need for many words. Their goodbyes had been said in 100 shared glances, in 1,000 unspoken thoughts over the past weeks. He reached out and gently touched the small bird in her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a symbol of flight, of a freedom he was about to seize and she could only dream of. A wave of grief, sharp and powerful, washed over him. The price of his own liberation. "Go, Noah," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the rising howl of the wind. Her eyes were luminous with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. She would not make this harder for him. "Go, and don't look back." She would not make this harder for him. He looked at her, memorizing her face in the stormy twilight, a face of strength and love and unbearable loss. "I'll send a sign," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not allow himself to fully feel. "When you see a red-tailed hawk circle twice over the river, high in the sky, know that I am free." She gave a single, sharp nod, a tear finally breaking free and tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. He wanted to say more, to tell her everything she meant to him, but the words were a luxury he could not afford. He gave her hand one last squeeze, a final, silent promise, and then he turned his back on the only home he had ever known. The storm broke in its full, unrestrained fury. It was as if the sky, in a fit of rage, was trying to scour the world clean. Rain came down not in drops, but in blinding, horizontal sheets, driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee. The plantation was plunged into a primal chaos of sound and fury as thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the very ground, and lightning bleached the world white for a fraction of a second, revealing a landscape in turmoil. Under the cover of this elemental rage, Noah Johnson slipped away from the quarters. He was a shadow moving through other shadows, his body bent low against the gale. His bare feet, guided by memory, found the familiar, muddy path that led toward the river. The world was a roaring, violent symphony of wind and water. But in his heart, there was a strange and profound calm. His heart was a steady drum against the storm's wild rhythm, a beat of pure, unadulterated purpose. He was no longer running from something. He was running toward everything. The journey through the storm was not a flight, but a baptism. The world dissolved into a primal chaos of sound and water, a landscape Noah had known his entire life rendered alien and hostile. The path he had memorized by sight and touch was now a slick, treacherous stream of mud that tried to pull him down with every step. The wind was a physical force, a solid wall he had to push through, its howl, a chorus of all the screams the plantation had ever swallowed. Branches, torn from ancient oaks and hickories, flew through the air like dark, jagged spears. He was blind, but not lost. His hand, tucked deep in his pocket, was wrapped around the smooth, cool river stone Josiah had given him. It was an anchor in the maelstrom, a solid piece of memory and purpose. His other senses took over, guiding him where his eyes could not. He could feel the slight incline of the land, smell the thick metallic scent of the churning river ahead, and hear the particular way the wind tore through the canebrakes versus the tall pines. This was the final test, a crucible of wind and water designed to strip a man of everything but his will to live. He was no longer afraid. The fear had been burned out of him in the cypress graveyard, drowned in the sweat of his labor and the quiet defiance of his soul. The storm felt like an extension of the turmoil that had been raging inside him for years. A violent, external manifestation of his own caged spirit. Now, as he moved through it, he felt a wild, exhilarating sense of liberation. He was no longer a slave cowering from a master's rage. He was a man communing with the raw, untamable power of nature itself. He was a part of something immense, something that could not be bought or sold or whipped into submission. He threw his head back and let the rain lash his face, washing away the dust of the cotton fields, the grime of the quarters, the scent of his own servitude. He was being washed clean, reborn in the heart of the tempest. Back at the main house, Frank Dyer was woken not by the thunder, but by a nagging, persistent sense of unease that had wormed its way through his drunken stupor. The house groaned around him as the wind assaulted it, and in a moment of terrifying clarity, he remembered Noah's eyes, that chilling finality. He sat bolt upright in his sweat-soaked bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. A premonition, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of whiskey in his brain. He stumbled out of his room, his voice a ragged shout swallowed by the wind. "Noah!" When he got no answer, a sour, drunken panic began to set in. This was wrong. The boy should be in his cabin, cowering from the storm like the rest of them. He grabbed a lantern from a hook by the door, its flame dancing wildly, and stumbled out into the deluge. The wind nearly tore the lantern from his grasp. "Noah!" he screamed again, his voice a pathetic shred of sound against the gale. He lurched toward the quarters, the rain plastering his thin shirt to his skin, the mud sucking at his boots. He kicked open the door to Noah's empty cabin, the wind and rain rushing in behind him. He roused a few other slaves from their beds, his voice frantic and slurring, ordering them to form a makeshift search party. They emerged reluctantly, their faces sullen with sleep and resentment, their fear of the storm warring with their fear of him. It was a futile, pathetic effort. The lantern flame, which had been his only point of light and authority, was instantly extinguished by a gust of wind and a sheet of rain, plunging them into absolute darkness. Their calls were lost in the gale, their movements clumsy and pointless. Dyer was alone in the roaring dark, shouting the name of a man who was already gone, his authority as extinguished as the flame in his lantern. Noah reached the bank of the Pearl River and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. It was no longer a river. It was a monster. In the strobing, intermittent flashes of lightning, he saw a raging brown torrent, a liquid beast that had swallowed its banks and was now chewing at the edges of the forest. The water churned with immense, terrifying power, carrying whole trees, fence posts, and the dark, bloated shapes of drowned animals in its maw. For a single, heart-stopping moment, a flicker of doubt, cold and sharp as ice, pierced his resolve. This was not the gentle river of his observations, the potential ally of his plans. This was a killer. This was a force that could pulverize a man against a submerged log, or pull him down into a vortex of mud and debris from which there was no escape. The sheer, raw violence of it was beyond anything he had imagined. He took an involuntary step back, the river stone in his pocket suddenly feeling small and powerless. Then, in the next flash of lightning, he saw them, tucked under a small rocky overhang near where Dyer always tied his horse, sheltered from the worst of the rain, sat the overseer's spare boots. They were the same prized leather boots Dyer wore on special occasions, oiled and polished, a symbol of his status. He kept them there, along with a dry coat, for when he needed to wade into the shallows to deal with a snagged fishing line or a stubborn mule, unwilling to ruin his finer footwear. Seeing them sitting there so ordinary and out of place in the midst of the storm's fury was like a sign from the universe itself, a plan more brilliant and audacious than anything he had dared to conceive, clicked into place in his mind with the force of a divine revelation. He would not just disappear. He would not just run. He would leave a mystery. He would leave a story so powerful it would become a legend. He would turn his escape into an act of psychological warfare, a final, crushing blow against the man who had tried to own his soul. He would make Frank Dyer the author of his own haunting. A slow, fierce smile spread across Noah's face. A smile the lightning saw but Dyer never would. He moved with a newfound purpose, his earlier fear washed away by the sheer glorious audacity of his new plan. His actions became meticulous, a deliberate, step-by-step ritual of erasure and creation. First, he retrieved Dyer's boots from under the overhang. They were heavy in his hands, smelling of leather and polish, and the faint, sour scent of the man himself. He walked to the water's edge, to the very spot where the bank dissolved into the churning chaos. He knelt in the mud, the cold water swirling around his ankles, and placed the boots neatly, side by side, their toes pointing directly into the raging current. He arranged them with the care of a valet, as if their owner had calmly removed them before deciding to go for a swim in the middle of a hurricane. They looked absurd, impossible, and utterly convincing. Next, he began to walk backward, away from the boots, away from the river. He placed his own bare feet carefully in the soft, wet mud, creating a clear, deep set of tracks. Each footprint was a deliberate statement, a piece of the narrative he was constructing. The tracks told a simple, chilling story. A man had walked down to the river, and he had not walked back. He continued this slow, backward march for 20 paces, until his footprints were well away from the immediate churning edge of the water, ensuring they would be found. He reached the river's edge for the final time. This was the crucial moment, the hinge upon which his entire legend would swing. To simply plunge into the torrent would be suicide, his body likely to be found snagged on a branch a mile downstream, the mystery solved before it could even begin. He looked up. Above him, a massive cypress branch, thick and strong as a man's thigh, reached out over the water, its leaves already stripped away by the wind. It was a limb of the very swamp he had just conquered, now offering him a final, improbable ladder to freedom. Using the immense upper body strength forged in the cotton fields and hardened in the cypress graveyard, he leaped and grabbed the branch. It was slick with rain, but his grip was like iron. For a moment, he hung there, suspended between the land he was leaving and the water that promised a new life. Then, with a powerful swing of his body, he propelled himself out over the river, his feet leaving the ground, leaving the soil of Mississippi for the last time. He swung far out, the raging water a churning blur below him. He let the current, a force of unimaginable power, catch his legs, pulling at him, welcoming him, and then, with a final, silent prayer to the god of rivers and runaways, he let go. He was swept into the torrent, a helpless speck in a world of liquid fury. The shock of the cold, powerful water stole his breath, and for a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. The current tumbled him over and over, disorienting him, the roar of the water deafening. But then, Josiah's words echoed in his mind, a calm voice in the heart of the chaos. Asterisk, don't fight the water. Become the water. Asterisk. He stopped struggling, stopped fighting for control. He relaxed his body, letting the river take him. He became a leaf, a stick, a part of the flood itself. His head broke the surface, and he gasped for air, the rain still lashing down. A few yards away he saw a large log, a casualty of the storm, bobbing and spinning in the current. It was his ark. With a desperate, focused energy, he maneuvered himself toward it, his movements now working with the currents, not against them. He reached it, his fingers clawing at the rough bark, and clung to its side, his head and shoulders barely above the churning water. He had done it. He had become part of the river, a piece of anonymous driftwood carried by the flood, leaving behind nothing but a pair of empty boots, a set of impossible footprints, and a riddle that would echo down through the generations. Dawn broke not with a fiery announcement, but with a quiet, hesitant grace. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, dripping, and profoundly silent. A pale, watery sun broke through the tattered gray clouds, casting a gentle, forgiving light on a landscape remade. Every leaf on every tree wore a jewel of water. The air, scrubbed of its oppressive humidity and dust, smelled of wet earth, pine, and the clean, sharp scent of distant rain. It was a world reborn. Into this pristine silence, a search party moved, their presence a violation of the morning's peace. It was led by a haggard and now chillingly sober Frank Dyer. The whiskey had worn off, leaving behind a pounding headache and a raw, sandpaper-edged dread that was far worse than any drunken rage. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide and bloodshot, darting nervously at every shadow. He was followed by a half-dozen slaves he had roused, their faces grim and weary, their movements slow with a reluctance that bordered on insubordination. They made their way toward the river, their boots sinking into the soft, sodden ground. They found the scene just as Noah had left it. The river, though still high and muddy, had receded from its peak fury, its voice now a low, powerful murmur instead of a roar. And there, on a patch of damp mud, sat the boots. They were perfect, impossible, a stark and surrealist portrait against the natural backdrop. They sat side by side, their leather dark with moisture, their toes pointed toward the water as if their owner had just stepped out of them. Leading away from the boots, clear in the damp earth, was a single set of bare footprints, pressed deep into the mud, marching directly away from the river, and leading down to the water, to the very edge where the mud dissolved into the current, was another set of tracks, the same bare feet, pointing in. But from the river, nothing returned. The story was written there in the mud, a simple, terrifying, and utterly inexplicable narrative. The men stared in stunned, bewildered silence. The sheer wrongness of the scene held them captive. It defied logic, defied the known world of masters and slaves, of whips and chains. One of the older men, his voice a dry whisper, finally broke the spell. He walked right in. The words seemed to snap something in Dyer. The quiet dread that had been gnawing at him erupted into a volcano of pure, frustrated rage. "No," he snarled, his voice cracking. "No, this is a trick, a game. He's mocking me." He lunged forward, his face a mask of fury, and kicked one of the boots. It flew through the air and landed with a soft splash in the shallows, where the current immediately caught it and began to pull it away. "He's mocking me," Dyer screamed, his voice a raw animal sound of utter defeat. He turned on the other men, his eyes wild. "Find him. Search the river. He can't have gone far. I want him found. You hear me? I want his hide." He ordered them into the water. But it was a fool's errand. The current was still strong, the water cold and opaque with mud. They waded in reluctantly, poking at snags of debris and submerged logs with long poles. Their hearts not in it. They found nothing. No body, no sign of a struggle, no scrap of torn clothing. It was as if the Pearl River, in its infinite muddy depths, had simply opened its mouth and swallowed Noah Johnson whole, leaving behind only a ghost story written in the mud. Dyer stood on the bank, screaming Noah's name until his voice was a raw, shredded whisper, the sound lost in the vast, indifferent silence of the morning. Days later, a broken and defeated Frank Dyer stood before Master Wallace in the cool, dark study. The intervening time had not been kind to him. He hadn't slept, haunted by the image of the boots and the footprints. He had drunk himself into a stupor each night, only to wake to the same gnawing riddle. He could not explain what had happened because he did not understand it himself. He tried, his voice rambling and desperate, to make Wallace see the impossibility of it. He spoke of Noah not as a man, but as something other, a demon, a witch who had commanded the storm and charmed the river. Wallace listened, his face impassive, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He let Dyer's frantic, superstitious rantings fill the quiet room, his expression betraying nothing but a faint, clinical curiosity. When Dyer finally fell silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Wallace took a slow, deliberate puff from his cigar, the smoke a fragrant, lazy cloud between them. "I gave you a simple directive, Frank," Wallace said, his voice as cold and sharp as ice. "Control my property. Instead, you fixated on one man, and you allowed him to make a fool of you. You have become a liability." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Your stories of witchcraft and river demons do not interest me. They are the excuses of a man who has lost control of his senses. Your incompetence, however, does interest me greatly." Dyer looked up, his eyes pleading. "But, sir, the boots, the footprints, no man could just—" Wallace cut him off, raising a single, manicured hand. "I am not interested in your campfire stories. I am interested in the fact that a valuable piece of my property is gone, and the man I paid to prevent such a thing is standing before me babbling about black magic. You have lost your authority in the fields. You have become a joke to the very people you are meant to command. You are no longer useful to me." He pointed the glowing tip of his cigar toward the door. "Pack your things and be off my land by sundown. You are dismissed." There was no room for appeal in his voice. It was the flat, final sound of a business transaction concluding. Frank Dyer left the Wallace plantation not with a bang, but with a pathetic whimper. He was a broken man, his authority stripped, his reputation ruined, haunted by the ghost of a slave he could not break, and a riddle he could not solve. He rode away with a single bag, looking back one last time not at the grand house, but at the distant, silver-green line of the Pearl River, which held its secrets close. In the quarters, the story of Noah Johnson began as a whisper, a secret shared in the dark, a spark of hope cupped in careful hands. After emancipation, when the chains were broken and voices were freed, the whisper became a story, and the story became a legend. It was told and retold, growing with each telling, a beacon of defiance against impossible odds. It was a tale of the man who could not be owned, the man whose will was stronger than any whip, whose spirit was deeper than any river. It became a cherished piece of local folklore, a testament to the quiet, unyielding strength of a people who had endured so much. One spring afternoon, years later, a free woman named Elara stood washing clothes by that same river, her hands chapped but her own. She looked up, her eyes drawn to the sky by a sudden shadow. A red-tailed hawk was circling high above the water, its wings spread wide against the brilliant blue. It circled once, then twice, a perfect, deliberate spiral in the vast open air, before soaring away to the north. Elara watched it go, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, a smile that reached her eyes and erased the years of sorrow. Tears welled, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of release, of a promise kept. Old man Josiah, his back now bent with the great weight of his years, lived to see his grandchildren born into freedom. He would gather them around him on the porch of his own small cabin, and in the fading light of the evening, he would tell them the story. His eyes would twinkle with a secret joy as he spoke of the quiet man who listened to the river, the man who didn't fight the water, but became the water. He taught them that the river had a long memory, and that it always took care of its own. Decades passed. The 19th century bled into the 20th. The world changed, but the river remained. One bright spring morning, long after the floods had receded, a young boy, barely 10 years old, was fishing on the banks of the Pearl River. He was Noah's great-grandnephew, a boy born with a freedom his ancestor could only dream of, a boy who had grown up with the legend in his bones. As he walked around a familiar, sandy bend in the river, looking for a good spot to cast his line, he stopped. There, sitting neatly side by side at the water's edge, as if waiting for their owner to return, was a pair of ancient, waterlogged leather boots. The leather was cracked and peeling, the soles worn thin, but their shape was unmistakable. They looked as if someone had just taken them off. The boy was not afraid. He had heard the story 100 times from his grandfather, who had heard it from his father, old man Josiah. He looked at the impossible boots, then out at the wide, peaceful river. Glinting in the morning Sunday, he smiled, a knowing, respectful smile that was wise beyond his years. Noah Johnson was never found. His body was never recovered from the muddy depths of the Pearl River. But his story lived on, carried by the currents of the water that had set him free, whispered by the wind in the cypress trees. And they say that every spring, when the water pulls back to reveal the secrets it holds, the boots reappear, a silent, steadfast testament to the man who refused to be broken, the man who left his overseer's boots standing by the riverbank and walked into legend.